Sophia Noble today. Let me just tell you a little bit about Messy Conversations for those of you who haven't been here before. This is a project of Antioch University's undergraduate studies program to discuss race, racism, often specifically anti-Blackness and intersectionalities. And Messy Conversations runs like this for about 30 minutes. Sophia Noble will be in conversation with undergraduate professor David Tripp. And then we will open the conversation up to questions. But while Sophia and David are in conversation, please put your questions into the chat as they're listening and as the questions occur to you. And then you will be called on to read your question and join into the conversation. If you prefer to wait once the Q&A starts, you can also raise your hand and join in the conversation that way. We will go till 5 o'clock when some of our guests need to leave. And if you want to stay longer, then we'll continue the conversation till about 5:15 or 5:20 or so. So it is my true pleasure to welcome Professor Sophia Noble to Messy Conversations, and just a little bit about Sophia's work and scholarship. And I'm going to read this just so I don't forget. Sophia recently started she is an Internet Studies and Digital Media scholar. She started the Center for Critical Internet Inquiry along with Sarah Roberts at UCLA recently, and in 2018 published the book Algorithms of Oppression by NYU Press, which is available in our library as an ebook. Sophia is a professor in UCLA in gender studies, African American studies, and she carries an affiliation with the School of Information Studies and Education too, but Information Studies, which is the home of librarians, which Sophia is a librarian, which is probably the most important thing to know about Sophia's professional work. And that MacArthur genius is, yes, that's impressive, but her librarianship is important. And Sophia's work, in some ways you can say, focuses on the quotidian, what happens when one puts a query into Google, and how often what comes back is just a tangle of bias and harm. And Sophia's really put the spotlight on that and pushed back against assumptions of neutrality and fairness. And as the MacArthur Committee noted, Sophia Noble highlights the ways digital technologies and internet architectures magnify racism, sexism, and harmful stereotypes. And so we're so delighted that you're here, Sophia, for this conversation. And I also want to thank you so much for being such a good friend to Antioch, particularly our undergraduate studies. You've come to visit my classroom. You've read at the fundraiser for our beloved Bridge program, and you're here with us today. You know, you walk the talk, you show up, and I'm really grateful. Welcome back to Antioch, Sophia, and I'll pass it to you, David.
Thank you so much for that introduction to Sophia and Messy Conversations. And this is my second time meeting Sophia. I'm first at the Bridge fundraiser a few years ago, so it's nice to see you again. A lot's changed for you since I saw you last. To get us started, just, you know, I'm a big fan of your book. I teach one course at Antioch on technology, the self, and society, and I use elements of the book trying to bring students to greater consciousness about some of the social justice issues that are often hiding and lurking within technology and go missing. And so, you know, when I think about your book, in Lisa's introduction, she mentioned this, that algorithms are not neutral, right? If I was going to sum it up in a phrase, algorithms are not neutral, and that you make a claim that if society is structured by racism, then you can't be surprised that the tools of technology aren't also marked by that racism, that they amplify it and reinforce it in various ways. And that in the case of Google, which is your main point of focus, not only does it amplify that racism, you point out that the algorithms that are used are often built by young white and Asian men, and that their interests are buried in those algorithms. And the other interest buried in the algorithms, of course, is just the corporate interest of Google, which is no small thing. So I think that's a somewhat, an instant summary of what you're doing in the book. But you begin the first chapter with a great story about a parent, who needs to entertain their daughter and daughter's friends, and Google's Black girls, and the response is a bunch of porn sites. So could you start us off with that story?
Sure. I'm happy to be here, and I'm so grateful. I know it's a Monday and the end of the day, and all of you could be somewhere. So I'm just grateful that you're here with us. And Lisa, thank you so much for just always extending the invitation. As much as you will extend it, I will reach back and grab it. I'm honored because I understand that, just the role that Antioch plays in our community and in this world. And we need spaces to break the mold, to be, to surface radical alternatives to the status quo in so many ways. And really, this book is in that spirit and in that tradition too. Truly, I mean, it's also, a bridge between the personal and the political, or let's say a way to make it clear that the personal is political. And that parent that starts this book, thinking about her daughter and her nieces, and what kinds of things they might be interested in, and doing a search on Black girls, and because her nieces and her daughter are Black girls, and finding all the pornography, just so normalized, without any kind of even a sense that it's an aberration, that Black girl children would be misrepresented pornographically. That parent was me. And I really felt, and still do feel, like so many of the things that we come to understand as public problems really often start with us kind of in the intimate spheres of our life, in the mundane, in the everyday. And I always love talking with my colleague, Greg Leeser, because he and I both love C. Wright Mills so much, the kind of sociological imagination. And that was a book that really influenced me when I was an undergrad a million years ago. And how we think of the kinds of experiences that we have as being, again, like private troubles. And it's really important that we kind of bring them out into the public and kind of into the light. And when we do that, we start to see that there are many, many people sharing the same or similar kinds of private troubles. And there's actually something larger at play that we need to intervene upon that's affecting all of us. And so I try to write this book kind of in that spirit. It is, people say that it's written in a way that's extremely accessible. And I think of that, how hard it is, I know, for scholars and students always trying to find the fancy voice, students trying to find the scholarly voice. And I was trying to unlearn things like that in the writing of this book, because I wanted to write a book about Black women that Black women could read and digest and make sense of, and where our own stories and our own histories would not be obfuscated or obscured in some way through language, and through kind of like a scholarly positionality, even though I was writing this book to get tenure too. I mean, because there were many overlords in the process, who judge someone and judge their worth professionally through this kind of a project of writing an academic book. So trying to kind of break or push back on that mold too was part of this project. But, I think this is a kind of this like use of Black feminist epistemologies, ways of knowing, methods, which I use in this book to try to narrate an alternate conception of what technology is, who it's for, who wins, who loses, the lack of neutrality in these. And so, David, when you talk about like trying to teach a course on like, the self and society and technology, I mean, it's so difficult because those of us who try to teach these courses, and I'm sure you have this experience too, you're teaching it like you're at least 10 years ago when I was writing this and like teaching about it as a grad student when I was, and in the early years of my career as an assistant professor, was like screaming into the void because there were hundreds of millions of dollars invested into narratives of the neutrality of these kinds of technical projects. And science and technology studies scholars for a long time, feminist technology scholars have been trying to push back on the kind of alleged neutrality of these projects. But this book is really just designed to show case after case after case after case evidence that algorithms are more than just directions that you give to a computer to calculate a set of possibilities, probabilities, to draw computational conclusions around different kinds of data. Algorithms are also imbued with our values. They're social constructs. They are made by people. Now, saying that today just seems like, I don't know, it almost seems like, is there still something to talk about? Because I feel like we read stories every week now in the news about some fatal algorithm or some subjective dimension of AI that has dangerous social consequences. But when I started writing this, there was not very much at all in this space. And of course, who gets to narrate what technology is not typically Black women. Who gets to be heard and taken seriously, who's a credible authority, is often not women, and often not women of color, and often not Black women, and not working class women, and not first gen college women, and all the things we could just name. And so this book was doing something, I think, on a lot of those fronts to try to put maybe a different set of voices. And many of the people that I cite in this book are the women of color, the people of color, the LGBTQIA plus people, scholars, journalists, activists, whose work was the cutting edge work to help destabilize this idea that algorithms were just neutral and that they were not political artifacts. And so that's, yeah, so now we're in a different conversation, and I'm really grateful that we're kind of like maybe some of the things that we can take as a given now, we can kind of see who did the work so that we can keep listening to all those kinds of communities and all those kinds of people who I think are often in the crosshairs, or their communities are in the crosshairs of the most harm.
Yeah, a couple of things, Sophia. One is, thank you for mentioning C. Wright Mills. So now my students will know somebody other than me reads C. Wright Mills. So, but it's one of the things that I really appreciate so much about your book, which is the voices that you were just talking about that you bring into the book, and to me, I get the challenges, but it's one of the real strengths of the book. You mentioned the Black feminist technology studies as informing your method for a lot of for the work in the book. My guess is not many of us know what does that entail. You mentioned the epistemologies that are connected with that, but could you unpack Black feminist technology studies for us a little bit?
Yeah. So, I don't know, while I was working on the book, I wrote this paper, maybe it was right after, I don't know, somewhere in the process, that was kind of like a call for Black feminist technology studies as a way to say, when we use Black feminism, like I did in the book, as a kind of a standpoint for looking at the internet and large-scale digital media platforms, we center different people. So we center Black women. And there was this amazing book, I had it here. I think I took it downstairs, but it was called The Googlization of Everything and Why We Should Worry by Siva Vaidyanathan. And Siva's book came out when I was in graduate school, and it was an amazing, amazing book. There was also this like very doomsday documentary that came out that was called Google and the World Brain. And together, they will keep you up, like you're not sleeping after you read these and watch these, because, it was kind of like the warning that Google has too much power in our society and the consequences are going to be profound. But like many books, and films, they're generic. They're like for humanity, for society. And what that does is it really creates too much appreciation for the positive and all the people who benefit, and not enough attention on the harm or the consequences. And that those are different. They're uneven. It's uneven power, they kind of the asymmetries of power in the world and in our societies and our communities. And so, I left both of those projects feeling like, right, but see, if you centered women of color or Black women or poor people, then you would ask different questions and you would actually come up with very different conclusions. So that was what I kind of set out to do using critical race theory and Black feminism. I can't even believe that it's like almost feels frightening to even say the words critical race theory in this moment. When I was writing the dissertation and working on the book, nobody even really outside of legal scholars and people in Black studies really didn't even know what critical race theory was. And so here we are now with something like 21 states or something, 20 states that have attempted to pass laws or have passed laws banning critical race theory. I mean, to me, it was like such a non-controversial frame for thinking about the internet, just to say like, oh, well, like racism is a part of our historical and kind of contemporary context, and we should account for that when we study things or social phenomena. But, to write a book using those theories and methods was very, very novel. I can remember, and this is for students here too, I can remember trying to surface and say things in grad, like research lab meetings that I was in, the only Black person in my whole PhD program for years. I think that like the one person who graduated a couple of years before me, Andre Brock, who's a famous scholar of Black Twitter, is a professor at Georgia Tech, and he writes about the aesthetics of Blackness online. He had graduated from our program maybe 4 or 5 years before. And then there was me. And then like years after I graduated, there was someone else. So, it was like that, only one at a time, I guess. And I would sit in research labs and I'd say things like, oh, this work is looking at information systems like Google, comparing them to what's lost, or what the challenges are, the historical challenges have been in librarianship. And it uses critical race theory and Black feminism to kind of, forge a new field that I think we need of like Black feminist technology studies. And I would have professors who would say things like, what is Black feminism? Who's ever even heard of that? Like, you cannot use that. No, like, stop right now. And I'd say, well, there's a whole gender studies department and a whole African American studies department on the other side of campus, and they've heard of that. And the field of information science or librarian information science was just not ready, and maybe still trying to get ready. So I think that was really what the call was to me, was to center different people, so that we could ask different questions and develop new methods for thinking about the internet. And that includes that, Patricia Hill Collins was so important. I mean, everybody who's from the 90s, or read her. I mean, I read the first edition when it came out in 91 or 90, when I was an undergrad myself. And now that book is still picked up brand new by generations. And it's so amazing to see that. But, I remember a line that she wrote in that book, and she said, "I could not write a book that Black women could not read." And so that made me think of, like, well, what are the methods I could use to make visible, like, the concerns and the results that I was finding. And, there were people who would say, because information scientists, it's full of computer scientists and people who are like, oh no, you have to do like a big data analysis and a super quantitative thing. And where's the statistics? And I was thinking, yeah, that's not going to make the case to the people who need to care about this too, and who actually are in the crosshairs of some of the kinds of things that I'm talking about. So those kinds of, even the methods of trying to do this research could have been a barrier. And so Black feminist technology studies was also about, like, using that as a method to really make plain the kinds of claims that I was making about the things that I was finding. And I think we need more fields that help us use theory and methods to make life or death kinds of projects accessible to, especially to the people who might be harmed by them.
Yeah, brilliant job of unpacking that and demonstrating some of the values of that perspective for our work, whether as faculty or as students. Really appreciate that a lot. So I want to briefly touch some of Google's response to your challenge, right? Which is, hey, we're not responsible for the content of these sites. Like that, we didn't make these sites. And, maybe you got those findings, but maybe someone was using your computer to search porn, right? So, or what choices the searcher made in the way that they phrase, that's on them. That's not us as Google. Or if there really is a problem, well, we can deal with that over time as we hire more diverse programmers and coders and so on. So I wonder if you could just briefly take up some of those arguments and how they landed for you.
Yeah. Well, most of the people who work at Google that I've ever met and spoken with over the years are so NDA'd up, they just cannot talk to me, and they can't talk to journalists for the most part, or researchers. So that really limits, the ability to do the kind of investigative work that maybe a journalist would be interested in doing and talking about. Certainly, I have seen executives from Google who have responded publicly to the book and who say things, they're very thoughtful with the word choices, which is always surprising to me because, if you think about some of the tech companies and the way their leadership responds to critics, some of them are like, I don't know that person. They're like the Mariah Carey gif. They're like, I don't know her. They're like that. They just completely disavow. Others are like, if you say something about us again, we'll kill you. And, I always thought Google was going to be on that. I was, I've always made this joke about that, when I'm in a car accident of one and I'm silk-wooted, like, start in Mountain View. But they actually haven't. They've been, I can see with some of my publications, for example, that are IP traced, that, hundreds and hundreds of downloads into Mountain View. So, things like that, where I know their workers are reading. In fact, I know from people inside Google that my book was just like a big book of tickets. I'm sure they just handed to some team and said, just start fixing it. Just go. And I see the evidence of it over the years. So many things that have changed, and then some things that have reverted back, and some things that haven't been touched yet. So, there's like a lot of different things. I think generally their position is that they use Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, of the FCC, to say that they are not responsible. They're not publishers. Of course, this is really, I think, an unsustainable position, because the question I always pose is, if Google's not responsible for what it displays in its product, like in the first, 20 or the first 30 million results, if it's not responsible for its algorithms display, then who is? I mean, you made an algorithm that could be manipulated, gamed. Your whole project is about displaying websites that highly correlate with your advertisers' purchase of keywords. That is the product. So you can't then turn around and say you're not an advertising engine, you're just like a neutral space. You also can't conflate that you are an advertising platform with something like making all the world's knowledge available. Because anybody who works in advertising knows that advertising is not like a knowledge sharing project. It's actually about a behavioral manipulation project to get people to buy things or see certain things. So the book is really invested. I'm invested in taking apart kind of their claims, their public claims of not being responsible, and then putting back on them the tremendous responsibility they have. Now, if you couple that with the fact that Google has aggressively bought up competitors, worked to, collude with other companies to maintain its monopoly status, which is the subject of Department of Justice investigation, Texas AG. I mean, there's lots of probably the FTC. So if you look at it that way, then it's like they also have created the conditions for their monopoly status and their incredible profit share that they get from people and companies and industries that pay to have their results more visible than anything else. And then they displace any other possible alternatives. So I can tell you, in the UC system, for example, we have Google providing the entire IT backbone for the system. So now you have the ability to data mine all of the student, staff, and faculty and anyone else. You, as a California company, you don't pay taxes for the most part. Most of the tech sector doesn't pay taxes, federal or very little state. They get municipal level subsidies. And so now we have no tax base to fund the alternatives, like libraries and schools and universities and colleges and public media and public health and all of the things that taxes, our collective like tax base goes to fund for society. And that also then weakens all of those institutions and creates the conditions for Google to come in with its solutions, right? So this is part of like the political economy that I'm trying to also show of like how the internet works, how digital media companies work, which is they suppress all competition, they position themselves as neutral, they weaken civil society, and then they rush in and capitalize on that. And who pays the highest price are not just people of color and vulnerable people, but like the public at large too, or people who are dependent upon these kinds of institutions and are then over and over directed right back to Google's products. And that's part of the challenge here.
Yeah, and even larger, if we wanted to go larger, perhaps democracy
For
itself.
sure. No question.
You know,
No question.
it's somewhere I ran across the phrase, you know, the ideology of information, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that before, but it seems that it carries this concern that information is neutral, right? So when we distinguish information and knowledge, and information, oh well, that's just information. It's just neutral, clearly, and then we tie that with the need for information for a healthy democracy, right? So everybody should have access to information so that we can make good decisions and so on and so forth. But then, you know, Google interested in the form of information. It seems to me that and as it's tied to their advertising algorithm. Another approach to information is libraries, which is interested in the content of information and the fairness of information, and you know, and so on. And so, you know, as I'm reading your book, I'm rereading it. I'm thinking, yeah, well, so why aren't librarians in charge of search engines? And in the little bit of time that I have directly with you, I'm wondering about some of the solutions that you suggest in the end of your book for these problems. If you could touch on those a little bit.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I really argue for is that librarians kind of own their rightful place as long-term, like over centuries, custodians, stewards of knowledge in society, various societies and communities. And of course, that is extremely political itself, because we know that librarians really have served the ruling class. And the tradition of radical librarianship is fraught, you know, and is a struggle. It's a niche compared to the dominant field, and the field. And I know, because I've worked in information schools, and I went to an information school, you know, most of my career, and even in those spaces, you know, for those of us who use these kinds of, again, frameworks for thinking about librarianship, even we are derided. And, you know, people will say, why do we need critical race theory in librarianship? Like, that's a waste of time and of energy, and our students don't need that, and that's not going to help them get a job. So it's like a super hyper practical orientation, even though it's obvious that we need much more vocabulary, artistry, practice, and power to speak back to things like white supremacy and patriarchy and heteronormativity, and so that can't be on the back burner as far as I'm concerned, but it is in our field. And so the call was to librarians to kind of like grapple with these issues in their collection development, in the way that they think about trying to constantly model themselves after companies like Google, like being super simple, using database-driven models, not even keeping, in some cases, books in the stacks in the library. They're just like, you have to order it up, right, from the database. And what a difference that makes in the kind of knowledge acquisition process, because I can tell you that if I send my students to the library, like I do, and I say, take a journal and go look up a book you're interested in, any subject, just look for a title that looks interesting. They'll usually go for the first or second or third hit that comes up in the database, right? So already they're constrained by the metadata that's being used to describe the topic they want. And you're just hoping, and I think sometimes it's a little bit of a crapshoot, because of all of the AI that's used in indexing books now. So you have, people going, and then I say, go to the stacks. And of course, when they get to the stacks, they start to see something else like context. Like, many times my LGBTQ students will go to the library and look up something around sexuality and identity maybe. And they go and they're looking for this item. And then all of a sudden they see like, well, all the books I'm interested in around sexual orientation and identity are somehow shelved really close to books about sexual deviance. And then they realize like, oh, like all of a sudden the subjective nature of the legacies of heteronormativity, right, and homophobia are present in the stacks, and they can see it, and it changes the way they think about knowledge and who gets to articulate the terms of knowledge making, knowledge dissemination, knowledge collection. And that is something that is so powerful and important, I think, because it gives us a chance to say, these are political struggles. These are struggles over values, over whose humanity counts, over the process of being humanized and dehumanized. Like all of these things are very important. And so if you flatten it and just think of like the database gave me the answer to the query, you lose so much of that. And those are the things I worry about in terms of what search engines do to acculturate us to this kind of, normalized, flattened, decontextualized, alleged knowledge portal. I think it's like anything but you have to have these contrasting experiences and spaces to make that legible. And so I call for things like, not only should librarians have like public interest search engines that they curate that are not driven by a profit motive or advertising as the model to fund it, but what if we had thousands of search engines instead of one monopoly leader or three that anyone, or four that anyone can even think of in the US? Maybe we would have a much more refinement and refined thinking, and we would think about all the things, like my favorite example I love to give to my students is like, the water bottle where I hold it up. I learned later that I guess like maybe Marx gave a lecture where he used this similar example, and I'm just saying I never saw that. I just like thought I thought of this on my own, but obviously I didn't. But it's like the holding up the glass of water, and I say to my students, okay, what is this? And then I say, well, if we were talking about this water bottle in an art and design class, how would you articulate what it is? If we were in a chemistry class, how would you articulate what this is? If we were in industrial design, how would you think about it? I just go through so many different fields and to help them understand. So that's the difference in going to college and thinking in complex ways about our world versus just like tapping on the glass and getting the answer. And I'm like, if you could just tap on the glass and get the answer, why are you at UCLA? Why are you at USC? Why are you at Illinois? Why are you even in college? If the answer can be known. And of course, again, these are the reasons, but those are the kinds of threats, because you definitely see provosts and people saying like, what do we need the campus library for when we have Google? And why don't we just record faculty lectures and put them on the internet? And then we don't need universities, or we don't need colleges, or those arguments actually get made. And I think we have to resist that as much as possible.
Sophia, I want to talk with you for hours and hours, but I know a lot of
My
questions.
answers are too long. I apologize.
It's all right.
Like you
a lot
asked
of
one
questions
question.
have come in that Lisa's been curating.
Yeah.
So I'm going to hand it back to you.
All right.
Thank you, David. And the first one is, Cynthia, do you want to read your question?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Noble, for being here with us so much. And so many other questions have come up, and there's so many great ones in the chat. But it was really simple, and it came up really early. What is the book that you would write now? With so much has changed, so much has happened. Well, when you were writing, I mean, a lot of people were saying, well, no, this is completely neutral, you know. Now people are seeing that it's not neutral, but there's a whole faction of people who believe. They think they're not getting a vaccine because something they read on the internet told them that, you know, the government is not going to be tracking them, you know, so they're getting information there.
Yeah.
What would be the different book that you would write now?
I think the thing that keeps me up at night that I would write about next would be predictive analytics, and like really helping people understand that the ubiquitous deployment of AI across so many different industries and institutions, systems, really, like, I would really help people understand that these snapshots in time that are captured about us through all the different kinds of technical engagements that we have build data profiles about who we are, and those data profiles are bought and sold to thousands of companies, you know, in real time, and they open up opportunities or foreclose opportunities based on kind of how these systems read who we are. And I would really spend the time. I'm sure someone's already written it, will write it, or it's about to come out. But that to me is probably the most crucial thing, because I think that's where we will see the greatest site of rollback of civil and human rights and sovereign rights, for sure, because these systems are so opaque. There's so much money behind the discourse that predictive AI or AI is liberatory, you know, and then it will make things easier and more efficient. And I think what it will do is strip us of our rights right before our eyes, and we won't even know how that happened. We won't, and we'll experience it so hyper individually that it'll be very difficult for us to see like harms against like protected classes and other groups of people. So that's the thing now.
Thank you, Sif. Thank you, Cynthia. And hi, I didn't know that was you. Connor has a next question, which I think kind of relates nicely to Cynthia's.
Yeah, thank you again so much, Professor Noble. My question just has to do with kind of thinking about, the current political playing field and different forms of ideologies and political parties of who is questioning and challenging technology. And I'm particularly thinking about the current kind of conservative and Republican backlash against technology we're seeing from, people like Senator Josh Hawley. So my question was, what do you see as kind of the state of the political playing field when it comes to technology and society? And does the backlash from the right have the potential to co-opt other forms of activism in the tech space?
Yeah, it's really interesting because people do often want to talk about like conservative bias. Conservatives want to talk about that. And Hawley obviously has colluded with people who appear to also be tech activists who are in movies and are known. Sorry, I just touched my watch and now it's talking. So I think that is a challenge, because when you look at the evidence, the truth is that there isn't a conservative bias, and there have been lots of great studies to show this. So what we're talking about again is like this very interesting overlap between kind of far right political actors and, let's say, people who are centrists and to the left, who are arguing about different things using the same language of like bias, right? And so this is one of the reasons why I think we have to be really clear about not talking and fixating on the tech bias, but talking about the values that are driving what's happening, so that then you can say, well, listen, is it true that people are being right-wing radicalized on YouTube or in other platforms? Where's the evidence of that? Where's the evidence of people being like left-wing radicalized? what you find over and over is the evidence of right-wing radicalization. I mean, there was just a study out by Facebook a couple weeks ago that came out. I think Carol was the profile, the fake profile that they set up when they didn't populate Carol with any information about who she was other than her name was Carol. And within 2 days, she was full-blown QAnon. So, we have to ask ourselves, like, well, what is that? Well, what we're talking about is people who are radicalized toward white nationalism, white supremacy, fascism, who are queued up for rolling back women's rights, who are kind of anti-democratic and do not support democratic institutions. And we need to call it that. We need to actually name those things, because when we don't name it, we get into what I think your question is getting at, which is like, all of it's biased and it's all biased the same way. Well, that's not actually helpful. That's not an analytic we can use because of course, technology is constantly discriminating. I mean, if you're a computer scientist, it's constantly like having to like algorithmically sort. That's just constantly sorting. So if it's sorting, it's discriminating. But what are the values upon which that sorting happens? And that I think is a more fine point to put on these conversations. And of course, the monopoly status of so many of these companies is really important. And it's just strange bedfellows around taking that on.
Satya, you have the next question.
Hello, thank you so much. Sorry, I guess I put a couple of things in here. I'll just go back to the first one so I can ask about that. I guess what I was wondering about is if you have any thoughts you might share on how you see us trying to change the impact that these algorithms and the coding and the way it's happening. For example, when we see things like, and forgive me, I don't know how to pronounce her name correctly, Timnit Gebru. Yeah, getting let go from Google after bringing up issues that they were seeing at the workplace. If we continue to have similar people writing the code, if we're not going to suddenly convince a whole bunch of companies to change who they're hiring dramatically, right? Yeah. That sort of thing will take time. So as you're mentioning here with the piece around values, like how do we shift those pieces or get more people looking at what the social impact is?
Yeah, I mean, Timnit is, it's so interesting because, I consider her a friend and colleague, and she's a, pure, Stanford educated computer scientist, PhD, who was really influenced, I think, by a lot of our work kind of out of the social sciences and humanities. And, she was like reading our work while she was doing her work. And then she, was hired as the head of ethical AI for Google. And when she and her colleagues at the University of Washington wrote this really important paper about discrimination and the reinforcement of racist and sexist patterns in kind of the new natural language processing systems that Google's developing, as well as their profound environmental destruction and kind of negative impact on the environment. She was basically summarily fired, and most of her team. And so I think what I'm learning watching how she has, just brilliantly landed on her feet. She's been funded, well-funded to make a new research institute that she's leading. And, when I think about that, it just reminds me that people like her, people like me, lots of people, especially Black women and women of color who have been working on these issues and facing different kinds of consequences for that lack of support in different ways. What we don't have is all the time, money, connections, resources to make technologies and ideate and bring to reality the worlds we want to live in, the worlds that we see as most just and most inclusive for everyone. And, I think about this often because I think that the lesson to be learned is if you hire people like Timnit and so many others, we will be compelled to work inside these institutions that don't have our best interests at heart and make it very hard for us to do our work and, in fact, punish us for doing our work. And or we could invest in women, non-binary, people who have not been the traditional employee and leader in Silicon Valley, Silicon Beach, all the Silicon corridors. What if we had the time, money, resources? What if we got funded and we just go into the Bohemian Grove in San Francisco and dream up a world we want and send a frigging car to outer space? I mean, we would never do that. We just wouldn't even think that was a cool thing to do. And yet here we have the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezos and the Mark Zuckerbergs. I could just name them. And they get to waste all the money on a lot of nonsense. And who pays the price are the most vulnerable people in our society. And I just think it's her firing actually has helped mobilize a lot of new conversations about why women of color must be invested in and our ideas be invested in, because we have been at the forefront of some of the most expansive movements for democracy in this country. And I don't see that work abating. It just needs to be supported.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to jump down to Patrick's question and then come back up to Sean and Barbara. Patrick, will you go ahead and ask your question?
Hey folks, good evening everyone. Hope everyone is well. I guess my question is, do they even care? I mean, the people in positions to make change or run these companies, I think it's pretty clear from the evidence they don't care and they're not going to be held responsible. So if you don't care, no one's going to hold responsible. What is the impetus to change at that point? We see all these hearings and they do all this double speaking, the lawyers do this. All this stuff came out about Facebook not too long ago. People just kind of move on and there's going to be no accountability. So I'm wondering, what do we do?
Yeah, I guess I think I see it a little bit differently. I think you're right that the company leaders don't care, the C-suite doesn't care, the shareholders don't care, the boards of directors don't care, except to the degree that these are political or financial liabilities that they have to kind of manage. I think there are people working around the world on regulation. And I think that's really important because we don't need millions of people to care about these issues, to be honest. I mean, 300 million people in the United States, we get up every day, we go to work, we live, we make pancakes, we feed the kids, we go to work, we do all the things, and no one has time to check the air quality. We just trust that someone's checking the air quality and that we're not going to walk outside and be poisoned. I think that there are people, myself included, who feel a sense of responsibility because we know things or we study things to work on the quality of life that's affected by these things. I take a kind of an abolitionist stance in my work, which is to say that it was only relative to the millions of people who lived and worked under the period of enslavement during the transatlantic slave trade, got up every day and witnessed horrific scenes just right in their faces, and then still just went to work. The abolitionists, really worked as a tiny community to end those kinds of social and political and economic practices. They still are working. And I think many of us, I would say, like people like Dr. Ruha Benjamin, myself, I think, there are some of us who see, Patrisse Cullors, lots of people who see their work as abolitionist in this space. And so, I have to hold on to that, because if I felt like we needed millions of people to care, our work would feel impossible. And, coordinated small groups of people can make change and have to. And so, so people will not be poisoned and harmed. And that's where I think all of us as educated, people, scientists, of all sorts, artists, have to do our work to be at the bleeding edge of society and kind of pushing the conversation in new directions and pushing the policy in accountable ways.
Thanks for that, Sophia. We're about at the 5 o'clock hour for those of you who might not need to leave. But I also wanted, both Sean and Barbara had questions around data mining and the costs of that, both in and out of the university. So I don't know if you want to take that now, or if folks need to leave at 5 o'clock, go ahead. But Sean and Barbara, if you want to read your questions for Sophia.
And first of all, Dr. Noble, it's like basking in sunshine being in your presence. It's like I could just spend days listening to this. It's so beautiful, and you're so thoughtful in your articulation of it. And I just want to say a couple of things about the conversation along the way, which is there's a wonderful podcast with Lex Freeman with Charles Isabel about predictive technology and race. And he has a quote in that podcast, which is, it takes about 18 hours of looking at someone's data, and you can start to make accurate predictions about their behavior. And I love what you say about tiny communities. The issue around tiny communities is sustaining them, through the streams of information. But perhaps I'd tie this into my question and make it all one big thing, which is, I spent most of my life, I grew up in San Jose, California, spent most of my life in technology, and it used to be called the information age, but actually it was the digital entry age, the data entry age, and the exponential growth and collection of storage and data gave rise to enormous data lakes, which are encapsulations of historical actions, activities, and values. The ongoing collection and storage of data often continues systems of bias and oppression, and there is a vulnerability to sharing data. So it's like so I wanted to, and also if maybe you can think about how you think about blockchain in this way. How do you think about data gathering in terms of empowering and liberating, as opposed to oppressing and suppressing?
Yeah, I love that question. I'm going to try to do it in 1 minute. I'll just say, I think, statistics was a really important field for showing inequality. I mean, sociologists really did a lot of important work using statistical methods because they were also able to show patterns of inequality and discrimination and all of the things that we needed to, that could be denied actually without the kind of quote unquote data. So I think absolutely we need information. We need to document. Data can be helpful in fighting back and speaking truth to power. The problem is the incredible uneven distribution of who makes and controls and stores the data, to your point, right? Such that, we'll never have what Facebook has on us, right? We'll never have what Google has on us. So that's part of the challenge too here, is just the way in which the datafication is weaponized against us because we don't have it either. And I think also there are some data shouldn't be kept. It's like how, my colleague Jean-Francois Blanchette and his collaborators have written about the social value of forgetting, right? That we don't keep juvenile records. We keep them sealed because they shouldn't over-determine what your future is, right? If you make a mistake. And so part of the problem is that data is a snapshot in time. And those snapshots are sewn together in ways that we don't have control over narrating, right? And they might be incorrect, they probably are. And those then become the proxy for who we are. And, you know, I hate to think, I mean, for sure, anybody Generation X on this call knows none of us would have jobs. None of us would be trusted to teach kids or young people because we did a lot of things that should not be captured on the internet or be used or weaponized against us, you know, like, so think about those kinds of things. Like, it's really to your point that the data lakes capture so much structural discrimination, historical discrimination, but they flatten it. And then there's no nuance to it. And they're just used as like, you know, value neutral proxy data for who should get what in our society.
So then, Sophia, Dr. Lipinski wants to know what happens when universities collude with Google and when they don't protect information.
Part of the reasons that universities collude is because they don't have any money anymore because of the really low, we get 4% public funding in the University of California system, 4%. So the other 96% comes from federal and state contracts, but mostly private industry and donors. So that's actually not a public institution. I mean, that's not a sustainable public institution. So we have to force these companies to pay their fair share into the tax base. We also have to force them to kind of restore what they've done to undermine our public institutions. And I'm really, really big on that, this kind of public restoration work, this repair work that has to be done by the sector. I think it's absolutely crucial. It's the only thing I'm talking about anymore, because I think that would lower the stakes of so many public institutions having to be reliant upon their funding. And of course, you know what they do. They cherry pick the researchers that are favorable to them. And then all the other humanities and social science departments are left to shrivel up and go away.
Thank you. That's the name of Sophia's book is Algorithms of Oppression. And it's an ebook available in the library to be read. And Satya, did you have another question?
Sure, thank you. This actually just ties into the question that was just asked about Google. So I am a master's candidate in clinical mental health studies, and one of the things we've seen in the pandemic is the rise of telehealth in a variety of capacities. And there were a very limited number of providers for what was considered, HIPAA compliant methods of doing telehealth previously, and we've seen sort of a ballooning of video conferencing services on a wide spectrum of platforms. And Google is actually one of the ones that is approved for use for telemental health, for example. And I'm assuming that it's most likely just one particular version of the product, so it's not the public free product. But nonetheless, sort of just reflecting in line with those questions about the university and what data they have access to, because the people who are then using those products are not technologists. So if I ask my therapist about what Google has access to, that's not something she's going to be able to answer. And similarly, I asked one of my professors, hey, I am turning in an assignment not through a learning management system, Sakai, but through Google, because I got an extension, I can no longer enter it in the other system. And supposedly it should be, I think it's FERPA compliant, the education related statute. Nonetheless, I was turning in a paper about my family of origin, which had a ton of really personal things in it. And by emailing it via Google, my professor, of course, not being a technologist, couldn't answer exactly what access Google has to that data in this particular instance, even though it is a FERPA certified product.
Yeah. I think you're really hitting on something, Satya, that's so important about the way in which these products are positioned to universities as technologies of efficiency, requirements. At UCLA, we're allegedly required to use Turnitin. I've never once asked my students to use Turnitin because I feel like if you were in my class and you wrote a deeply personal paper with the anticipation that it would just go to me to read and respond to, I can't guarantee you that it's going to not be sold which Turnitin then eventually was sold a few years ago. And it's got a whole searchable database of papers. And even if your name is taken off of them, of course, it's quite easy to re-aggregate data back to people. So now what happens when you are, running for school board and that paper shows up, or that paper is somehow weaponized against you in some form or fashion? I mean, these are the very, very real projects. We have a new system at UCLA where the resident advisors who, are students, they're undergraduate students who live on the floors with their peers. They have a new database where if they see something suspicious in a resident on their floor, they're supposed to write a report and put it in this database. And, I think I was the only person, again, screaming into the void. And I was like, how can you have people who are not clinically trained giving some type of mental health report on their peers? You're truly going to let some 19-year-old, 20-year-olds do this on each other? And of course, these are like liability mechanisms because more and more students are committing suicide or harming themselves. There has to be like paper trails that was documented so the university isn't liable. So you also have other lawyers and other people participating in these systems, in selling through these systems. And I think they're dangerous. I mean, what my position is. And I think what you see is your instinct is correct. And we need to, those of us who are like social theorists in the universities, we need to have our words. And, we need to use the mechanisms of the Senate or of our kind of power as faculty and our alliances that are so natural with students to push back on administrators who adopt these things. When faculty, I think, know the stakes, they behave differently. But a lot of them, you don't have to be a technologist to know. You could be a social work professor and know. You could be a student like in mental health services or other kinds of counseling to know. And I think that we need to not feel powerless that because we're not technologists, we don't have a say. Nothing could be further from the truth.
The point you brought up about the liability thing becomes, I think, very key. So I'm not allowed to communicate with my professors outside of that system, which means everything has to happen in that system. Right. And so I think I'm training for a second career. I was previously project manager and my last roles were in IT. So I have a bit of that hat on, which of course my professors mostly don't, because that's, wasn't their prior field. So I feel like, you'll hear it come up in people's concern around things like working with undocumented clients, because you don't want to have a paper trail that could potentially harm them. But then they may not be aware, like I have a practitioner of my own for a medical office where they have an online portal. Electronic medical records are a huge issue in this area as well. But they've capped the number of characters at 8 for your password, which basically they've hamstringed anybody. The odds of someone trying to hack an individual account, or unless you're being targeted, are low. Nobody cares, right? They're more likely to go over a high level sort of database steal. But nonetheless, if you're basically capping those passwords, so you're a clinician who thinks they're using a secure system but doesn't know anything about password management. There's some education too.
Sophia, I had just one question. I was at the Modern Language Association conference a few years ago, a panel of Black academic women who said, as you did in the beginning when you wrote your book, we're writing our book because we want to be read, which means that in a way it's a sacrifice, right, and a risk to do that. And just what it means to be, you spoke earlier about a Black woman in academia and a professor. And I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit as we kind of come to the end.
Yeah, well, I will say that getting a chance to come and speak with you all really means a lot to me, because I think of so many dimensions of what I spend my time on, being about like hitting certain marks or targets of productivity, of service, of teaching, that aren't always congruent with how I want to spend my life. Like sometimes I'm giving so much time and service to an institution that extracts only from me and does not give back to me. And so, when I can speak in the community and speak with people I care about, respond to my friends' requests, it's meaningful. And I think that for many Black women, we are overtaxed, many women of color. We do all the service, we do all the protection work for our students, we do all the repair work for students and colleagues who've been harmed by racism and sexism and homophobia and discrimination, class snobbery, certainly at a place like UCLA is an elite public school. So, for me, I'm the first Black woman, first Black person, first underrepresented minority in terms of like Black, Latinx, Asia Pacific Islander, Indigenous ever in the history of my department to receive tenure. And, when I think about that, like I'm in a department that, I don't know, it's probably like close to 100 years old or something. I mean, that tells you what the climate is like for us. And so I think we have to encourage each other. We have to hold each other up. We have to see each other. These opportunities feed me because I feel starved in other ways. And I think many Black women, there was this great book, I don't know where it is right now, but it's called Presumed Incompetent. And it's an anthology and a collection of women of color talking about their experiences in academia. And it always boils down to the fact that women of color are presumed incompetent. And so we have to prove ourselves like 200-300 times what anybody else. I was on a committee today that reports to the Chancellor of UCLA. Every single person on the committee was a dean, was either a chief X officer, was a distinguished professor. And there I was as an associate professor and a MacArthur Genius. Can you believe it? How am I a peer to the deans and the distinguished professors, but I'm just an associate professor, right? Not even a full professor yet. So that's actually what it's like for many of us. It's like pushing a boulder up a mountain. But, I think my encouragement for students, for any of us in our identities where we are marginalized, is to work on things that will feed you, that you will care about, so that when you have to do the other things in service to institutions, that your work matters in the world for the communities that you're doing it for. And that is indeed the thing that keeps me going.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you
welcome.
so much for being here. Thank you.
Thanks all for having me. I appreciate you. Thanks, David, for the great conversation.
The beginning.
Just keep it going.
Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.
As people leave, a reminder, no